Margaret never imagined that the happiest day of her life would begin with her future husband calling her dress cheap trash in front of 300 guests. Standing at the altar of St. Michael's Cathedral, her grandmother's pearl-beaded gown gleaming in the stained glass light, she watched Richard's face contort with disgust. The same man who had whispered sweet promises into her ear for 2 years now looked at her, as if she were a stranger who had wandered into his perfect world uninvited. "This is what you chose to wear to our wedding?" His voice carried across the hushed cathedral, each word landing like a physical blow. "Margaret, we discussed this. I gave you my credit card. I told you to go to Vera Wang, to Monique Lhuillier, and you show up looking like you're at a yard sale." The gasps from the congregation felt like waves crashing against her back. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her simple bouquet of daisies and baby's breath flowers she had picked from her own garden that morning. Another detail that now seemed woefully inadequate under Richard's withering stare. How do we measure the worth of love? Is it in the zeros on a price tag? Or in the hands that carefully stitched each bead, each memory, each dream into fabric that has weathered decades of family celebrations? Margaret's grandmother Rose had worn this very dress when she married her grandfather in 1952. Her mother had walked down the aisle in it during the flower power era of 1971. And now, in 2024, Margaret had believed she was honoring 3 generations of love. The dress had been altered, updated with modern touches, but its essence remained, a testament to enduring commitment and family tradition. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of uncomfortable guests shifting in their pews. "This dress, it belonged to my grandmother. It's been in my family for— I don't care if it belonged to Queen Elizabeth herself," he interrupted, his perfectly groomed features twisted with embarrassment. "Do you have any idea who's sitting in this church? My business partners, my investors, people who control millions of dollars in deals. And my bride looks like she can't afford to dress herself properly." The words hit her like a slap. Margaret felt the color drain from her face as she realized that every eye in the cathedral was fixed on her, watching her humiliation unfold in real time. Richard's groomsmen shuffled awkwardly behind him, while her bridesmaids, her sister Sarah, her college roommate Jennifer, and her childhood friend Patricia, stood frozen in horror. But what happens when the very moment meant to unite 2 souls instead reveals the vast chasm between 2 completely different values, 2 entirely different definitions of what makes life meaningful? Richard turned to address the congregation, his voice booming with the same authority he used in boardrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this situation. Obviously, there's been some sort of misunderstanding about appropriate wedding attire. Perhaps we should postpone." "No." Margaret's voice cut through his speech like a knife through silk. Something inside her, maybe it was her grandmother's spirit, maybe it was simply the accumulated strength of 47 years of life, suddenly straightened her spine and cleared her throat. "No, Richard. There's no misunderstanding." She looked out at the sea of faces, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the drama unfolding before them. "This dress represents 72 years of marriage in my family. My grandmother wore it when she promised to love my grandfather through the Great Depression, through World War II, through raising 6 children on a factory worker's salary. My mother wore it when she vowed to stand by my father through his struggles to build a small accounting practice that barely kept food on our table, but somehow managed to put me through college." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I wore this dress today because I believed I was marrying a man who would value tradition, who would understand that some things can't be bought in a store, who would see the love stitched into every seam rather than counting the dollars it didn't cost." The cathedral fell silent except for the soft sound of someone crying. Margaret realized it was Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor who had helped her alter the dress just last week. Richard's face had gone red, but whether from anger or embarrassment, Margaret couldn't tell. "Margaret, you're being ridiculous. This is about respect. Respect for our guests. Respect for the occasion. Respect for— Respect." The word exploded from her lips. Respect is not humiliating your bride in front of 300 people because her dress doesn't have the right designer label. Respect is not reducing a woman's worth to the price tag on her clothing. How many times do we compromise pieces of our authentic selves, believing that love requires us to become someone we're not? How many dreams do we abandon, thinking that acceptance means abandoning everything that makes us who we are? Margaret began walking backward, away from the altar, away from Richard, away from a life that suddenly seemed as foreign as a distant planet. You know what, Richard? You're absolutely right. This dress isn't expensive enough for you. Neither am I, apparently. She turned to face the congregation, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. I want to thank everyone who came here today expecting to witness a celebration of love. Instead, you've witnessed something far more valuable. You've seen what happens when someone shows you exactly who they are. And when someone shows you who they are, believe them. The walk down the aisle felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step took her further from the future she had planned and closer to a truth she hadn't been ready to face. She had been so blinded by Richard's charm, his success, his promises of security, that she had ignored every sign that they wanted fundamentally different things from life. Behind her, she could hear Richard calling her name, his voice shifting from anger to panic as he realized she was actually leaving. Margaret, Margaret, come back. We can work this out. You're overreacting. But Margaret didn't stop. She pushed through the heavy cathedral doors and stepped into the bright June sunshine, her grandmother's dress flowing behind her like a banner of freedom. What she didn't know was that karma was already setting its wheels in motion inside the cathedral she had just left. As Richard stood at the abandoned altar, trying to salvage his dignity in front of his business associates, his phone began to buzz. Then buzz again, and again. His best man, Thomas, reluctantly approached him with his own phone in hand. Richard, Thomas whispered urgently, you need to see this. Someone in the congregation had been live-streaming the wedding on social media. The video of Richard's cruel rejection of Margaret's dress, followed by her powerful response, was already spreading across platforms like wildfire. #wedding drama and #grandma's revenge were trending within the hour. But the real storm was just beginning. Among the wedding guests sat Patricia Chan, a prominent journalist for the Chicago Tribune who happened to be Margaret's childhood friend. Patricia had spent years covering stories about workplace harassment and toxic masculinity in corporate America. She recognized a story when she saw one. Within hours, Patricia had crafted an article that would change everything. The wedding that exposed a pattern. Local CEO's treatment of fiancé raises questions about company culture. The article didn't just focus on the wedding incident. Patricia had done her homework. She reached out to former employees of Richard's marketing firm, women who had been too afraid to speak up individually but found strength in numbers. Stories emerged of Richard's pattern of making comments about female employees' clothing, his tendency to promote based on appearance rather than ability, his habit of belittling women in meetings. Sarah Gonzalez, a former account executive, told Patricia, I was never surprised by what happened at that wedding. Richard once told me in front of the entire team that I should dress more professionally if I wanted to be taken seriously, even though I was wearing the same style of business suit as male colleagues. When I saw that video, I thought, there's Margaret finding out what we already knew. The story went viral. News outlets across the country picked it up. The video of Margaret's dignified exit was shared millions of times, with comments praising her strength and condemning Richard's behavior. But karma wasn't finished yet. Richard's marketing firm had several major clients in the fashion and beauty industry companies that built their brands on empowering women. The viral video and subsequent article created a public relations nightmare. One by one, clients began canceling contracts. Stella & Company, a women's clothing line that had been Richard's biggest account, issued a public statement. We cannot in good conscience continue our partnership with a firm led by someone whose values are so fundamentally opposed to everything we stand for as a company dedicated to celebrating women. Within 2 weeks, Richard had lost 60% of his clients. His business partners, the very people whose opinions he had been so concerned about at the wedding, called an emergency meeting to discuss his future with the company. Meanwhile, Margaret had returned to her small cottage on the outskirts of town, the same house where she had lived quietly for years, teaching elementary school and tending her garden. She expected to spend weeks wallowing in embarrassment and heartbreak. Instead, she found herself flooded with support from people around the world. Her principal called to tell her that the school board had received hundreds of messages praising Margaret's dignity and asking about ways to support her classroom. Donations poured in for school supplies, books, and educational programs. A vintage clothing designer from New York reached out, asking if Margaret would be willing to share her grandmother's story for a documentary about family heirlooms and the histories they carry. A publisher expressed interest in Margaret's story for a book about finding strength in unexpected moments. Most surprisingly, Margaret began receiving letters from women across the country sharing their own stories of moments when they had to choose between compromising their values and standing up for themselves. One letter particularly moved her. It came from a 60-year-old woman named Dorothy in Oregon. "Dear Margaret, I watched your video with tears in my eyes because 30 years ago, I didn't have your courage. I married a man who made me feel small, who convinced me that my dreams didn't matter, who slowly erased pieces of who I was until I barely recognized myself. I stayed for 25 years before I found the strength to leave. Watching you walk away from that altar reminded me that it's never too late to choose dignity over comfort, authenticity over approval." The days immediately following the wedding were perhaps the most difficult of Margaret's life. She had called in sick to school for the first time in 5 years, unable to face the curious stares and whispered conversations she knew would follow her everywhere. Her small cottage felt both like a sanctuary and a prison, filled with reminders of the future she had planned with Richard. Wedding gifts still arrived daily, each delivery a painful reminder of dreams that had crumbled in a matter of minutes. Margaret spent hours returning presents to senders with handwritten notes explaining that the wedding had been canceled. Each note was an exercise in grace under pressure, a small act of dignity that helped her reclaim pieces of herself. Her sister Sarah practically moved in during those first 2 weeks, bringing homemade soup and tissues, sitting quietly while Margaret processed the whirlwind of emotions. "You know," Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "Mom always said that Grandma Rose's dress had magic in it. Maybe the magic wasn't about guaranteeing a perfect wedding, but about revealing the truth when we most needed to see it." Those words planted a seed that would eventually grow into something beautiful. Margaret began to reflect on the signs she had ignored during her relationship with Richard. The way he had gradually discouraged her friendships with people he deemed beneath their social level. How he had rolled his eyes when she wanted to spend weekends visiting her elderly father instead of attending networking events. The subtle but persistent suggestions that she should upgrade everything from her car to her wardrobe to her hobbies. She remembered the moment 6 months earlier when she had excitedly shown him photos of her grandmother's dress, explaining its history and significance. Richard had barely glanced at the pictures before saying, "That's nice, honey, but we should probably get you something more contemporary, something that photographs well." She had dismissed his response as practical thinking, but now she recognized it as the first crack in the foundation of their relationship. How many red flags do we rationalize away because we're so invested in the story we've told ourselves about our future? How many times do we silence our inner voice because it's telling us something we don't want to hear? As the viral video continued to spread, Margaret began receiving interview requests from talk shows, magazines, and podcasts. At first, she declined them all, wanting nothing more than to disappear from public attention. But as the weeks passed and the letters kept arriving from women sharing their own stories, she began to understand that her moment of crisis had become a catalyst for something much larger than her personal situation. The breakthrough came when she received a call from Linda Morrison, a woman in her 60s who had driven 8 hours from Kansas just to meet Margaret in person. Linda had watched the wedding video and recognized something in Margaret's story that resonated deeply with her own experience. 40 years ago, Linda told Margaret over coffee in her kitchen, "I was engaged to a man who slowly convinced me that everything I loved about myself was somehow wrong or inadequate. My laugh was too loud. My career ambitions were selfish. My close relationship with my family was codependent. By the time I realized what was happening, I had become a shadow of myself." Linda had stayed in that marriage for 15 years, losing herself piece by piece until she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. "Watching you walk away from that altar," she said with tears in her eyes. Reminded me of the woman I used to be, the woman I could have remained if I had found the courage to trust my instincts. Stories like Linda's kept coming. Margaret realized that her wedding day disaster had inadvertently created a platform for conversations about self-worth, authentic relationships, and the courage required to choose dignity over convenience. 6 months later, Margaret was indeed writing a book not about the wedding, but about the journey that led her to that moment and everything that came after. She had realized that the humiliation at the altar wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new chapter she never could have imagined. The writing process became a form of therapy. Margaret delved deep into her family history, interviewing relatives about her grandmother Rose's life, uncovering stories that had never been shared. She learned that Rose had also faced a defining moment in her young marriage when Margaret's grandfather had lost his job during the Depression and wanted to abandon his family to find work in another state. Rose had stood her ground, insisting they face their challenges together, and that decision had shaped 57 years of partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. The book, titled Grandma's Dress, A Legacy of Love and the Courage to Walk Away, became more than a memoir. It evolved into a guidebook for recognizing the difference between love that lifts you up and relationships that gradually diminish your sense of self. Margaret included chapters on the warning signs she had missed, the importance of maintaining your own identity within a relationship, and practical advice for anyone contemplating walking away from a situation that no longer serves them. She interviewed relationship therapists, included exercises for self-reflection, and wove together the stories of dozens of women who had shared their experiences with her. The book became a bestseller within 3 months of publication. Margaret used the proceeds to start a foundation providing scholarships for women returning to school after leaving difficult relationships. But that was only the beginning. As for Richard, karma had several more lessons in store. The business he had built over 15 years crumbled within 6 months. His former partners forced him out, citing damage to the company's reputation. The man who had once controlled millions of dollars found himself starting over, but the lessons were far from over. Richard's fall from grace became a case study in business schools about reputation management and corporate responsibility. His name became synonymous with toxic leadership, making it nearly impossible for him to find employment in his industry. The network he had spent decades building abandoned him overnight, afraid that association with him would damage their own reputations. But perhaps the most profound consequence came in the form of personal reflection. Stripped of his wealth, his status, and his sense of superiority, Richard was forced to confront the man he had become. The empty luxury apartment he could no longer afford seemed to echo with the memories of all the people he had treated poorly over the years. One evening, 6 months after the wedding, Richard found himself at a diner in a part of town he had never visited before, counting coins to pay for a cup of coffee. At the next table sat an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with obvious joy and affection. The woman wore a simple cardigan that had seen better days, but her husband looked at her as if she were wearing diamonds. Richard overheard the man telling his wife, "You know, Dorothy, you're even more beautiful today than the day I married you in your mother's old dress. That dress was perfect because you were wearing it." The woman blushed and laughed, and Richard saw something he had never truly understood. Genuine love that had nothing to do with price tags or social status. For the first time since the wedding, Richard felt something other than anger or self-pity. He felt regret, not for losing Margaret, but for never really knowing her. He began to understand that he had lost something far more valuable than money or social standing. He had lost the opportunity to be loved for who he truly was, rather than what he could provide. The road to redemption would be long and uncertain, but that night in the diner marked the beginning of Richard's journey toward becoming a better man. He started volunteering at a homeless shelter, working without recognition or reward for the first time in his adult life. Slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild himself from the ground up. The foundation Margaret established, called Rose's Legacy, grew beyond anything she had initially envisioned. What started as a simple scholarship fund evolved into a comprehensive support system for women making difficult life transitions. The foundation offered not just financial assistance, but also career counseling, support groups, and mentorship programs. Margaret found herself traveling across the country, speaking at universities, corporate events, and women's conferences. Her message was simple but powerful. Authentic love never requires you to diminish yourself, and sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives are actually doorways to discovering our true strength. One particularly moving event took place at a community college in Ohio, where Margaret met Sarah Chun, a 52-year-old woman who had left a 30-year marriage after recognizing patterns of emotional manipulation that had slowly eroded her self-confidence. Sarah had used a Rose's Legacy scholarship to return to school to become a social worker, specializing in helping other women recognize the signs of psychological abuse. "Your story gave me permission to trust my own instincts," Sarah told Margaret after the presentation. "I had been questioning my sanity for years, wondering if I was being too sensitive or demanding too much. Seeing you stand up for your values reminded me that I had values worth standing up for too." These encounters happened everywhere Margaret went. In Denver, she met a 45-year-old teacher who had left a relationship where her partner constantly criticized her appearance. In Atlanta, a 60-year-old artist shared how she had ended an engagement after realizing her fiancé wanted to control every aspect of her creative work. In Seattle, a retired nurse explained how Margaret's book had helped her daughter recognize warning signs in her own relationship before making a terrible mistake. Margaret began to understand that her grandmother's dress had indeed been magical, not in the fairy tale sense she had once imagined, but in its power to connect women across generations, to serve as a symbol of the strength that comes from honoring our deepest values even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. 2 years after the wedding that never was, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard, handwritten on simple stationery, so different from the expensive letterhead she remembered from his business correspondence. In the letter, Richard acknowledged the pain he had caused and took full responsibility for his behavior. He didn't ask for forgiveness or attempt to justify his actions. Instead, he simply thanked her for showing him, through her dignity and grace, what real strength looked like. He mentioned that he had been volunteering at a shelter and was slowly learning to measure his worth by how he treated others rather than by what others thought of him. Margaret never responded to the letter, but she kept it as a reminder that growth and redemption are possible for everyone, even those who seem irredeemably lost to their own ego and pride. The transformation in Margaret's own life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. She had initially planned to return to her quiet life as an elementary school teacher, but her experience had opened doors she never knew existed. She was offered a position as a motivational speaker, consulted with organizations about creating healthier workplace cultures, and even appeared as a guest expert on several television shows discussing relationships and self-worth. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in her relationship with herself. Margaret had spent most of her adult life seeking validation from others, unconsciously believing that her worth was determined by whether someone else chose to love her. The wedding disaster had forced her to confront this belief and discover that the most important relationship she would ever have was the one with herself. She began taking art classes, something she had always wanted to do but had never made time for. She traveled to places she had dreamed of visiting, no longer waiting for someone else to share the experience. She deepened her friendships and spent more quality time with her aging father, recognizing that these relationships were just as valuable as any romantic partnership. Most importantly, Margaret learned to trust her instincts again. She had spent too many years second-guessing herself, allowing others to define what was appropriate, valuable, or worthy. The woman who walked out of that cathedral was not the same person who had entered it, and she never would be again. Sometimes the most devastating moments of our lives are actually doorways to a better version of ourselves, a life more authentic than anything we could have planned. As Margaret often tells audiences when she speaks about her experience, that dress taught me that some things are priceless not because of what we paid for them, but because of the love they represent. And the most important lesson is this: never let anyone convince you that their approval is worth more than your own self-respect. What would you choose, comfort and compromise, or courage and authenticity? Have you ever faced a moment when someone showed you exactly who they were? What did you do with that revelation, and how did it change the direction of your life?